Hello and welcome to another TLDR EU video. At the end of last week, there was major news out of Germany, with Armin Laschet elected to be the next leader of the Christian Democratic Union, a position formerly held by Chancellor Angela Merkel. This is obviously big news for Germany, but with Merkel leaving the Chancellery later this year, Laschet may just become the next Chancellor of Germany, and thus a major leader on the European stage. So in this video, we're going to discuss the election process, how Laschet was selected, and why he may not actually make it to the Palais Schaumburg. Germany's known for a huge number of things, like its iconic capital city, powerful leaders, and manufacturing sector. But it's also got an incredibly iconic flag. If you're into that kind of thing, you should cast a vote in the TLDR flag survey. We want you to have your say and help us decide what the best flag in the world is. Click the link in the description, vote on a random selection of flags, and help us choose the world's best. The results will be published on TLDR Global, so be sure to subscribe over there for the final results. The channel is also linked down below. So, last weekend, on Saturday 16th of January, the 1001 party delegates of the CDU cast their votes for the next leader of the party, with the results set to be certified on Friday the 22nd. To give a bit of background, the previous leader of the CDU was Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, or AKK as she's known. Before she became leader, AKK was the minister-president of Saarland, a region in Germany. She was popular and apparently competent, so when Merkel stepped down as the party's leader in December 2018, AKK took over. She won a tight leadership election against Friedrich Merz and Jens Spahn, both of whom are worth remembering because they're relevant to the current leadership election too. In the first round, she got 45% of the vote, while Merz got 39% and Spahn's 15%. In the runoff between AKK and Merz, she got 52%, while Merz got 48%. AKK was supposed to be Merkel's long-term successor, and was, as we said, originally pretty popular. But it turns out that she's not really the Merkel 2.0 that some people thought she would be. In her first national election, the 2019 European parliamentary elections, the CDU won just 29% of the vote, the lowest vote share they'd ever picked up in a national election. Then, in February, after CDU members in the regional Thuringian government voted with AfD members for a centre-right prime ministerial candidate, she was forced to resign. Now, we're not going to go into this in too much detail, but basically there's a convention in German politics that centrist parties don't form electoral alliances with far-right or far-left parties, because of, well, what happened in World War II. The CDU voting with the AfD for the same candidate was seen as a violation of this convention because the AfD are considered a far-right party. When AKK tried to intervene, the Thuringian CDU members didn't really listen to her, so she was effectively forced to resign. Anyway, the point is that the CDU needed another leadership election. Obviously, we don't make a video every time a German political party has a leadership election. We're only doing this video because the winner of the CDU leadership election is historically the CDU-CSU's Chancellor candidate, and historically, the CDU-CSU candidate usually ends up being the Chancellor and leading the whole country. So, who was in the running? Well, there were three candidates. Friedrich Merz, the guy who lost to AKK in 2018, Armin Laschet, the Minister-President of North Rhine-Westphalia, or NRW, Germany's most populous state, and Norbert Röttgen, the former Environment Minister and Foreign Policy expert. Interestingly, all three men come from NRW, and all hold law degrees. But who really are they? Well, let's start with Merz. Merz is a bit of a character. Originally a lawyer and then a judge, he joined the CDU in 1989. Merz was the leader of the CDU's parliamentary group, at this point in opposition. That was until 2002, when none other than Angela Merkel squeezed him out of the job. He remained a member of the Bundestag until 2009, when he decided to take a break from politics and do some business instead. He held some pretty serious positions in the financial sector, including heading up BlackRock Germany. Anyway, following that, he's now a millionaire. He's also a great public speaker, and definitely more conservative than Merkel. He's relatively anti-immigration and also not too keen on EU debt sharing. Electorally, his plan would have been to snatch back voters from parties to the right of the CDU, like AfD, and maybe also some FDP voters. Although doing so, he would risk losing some more moderate CDU voters, potentially to other parties on their left, like the Greens. Laschet is their second option, and he's the Merkel continuity candidate. He's the current Minister-President of the NRW, and he basically agrees with everything that Merkel says. However, he's had a pretty bad pandemic so far. He called for lockdown to end early, and also looked indecisive in the process. He is supported by the current Health Minister, Jens Spahn, who's pretty popular himself. We'll get onto him in a moment. The final option was Röttgen, the most left-leaning of the bunch. Originally, he was a bit of a long-shot candidate, but he did some pretty creative campaigning, including social media campaigning, including pictures of koalas and a Spotify playlist. Anyway, his campaign was big on climate change and Europe, and urged the CDU to focus on younger voters. Originally, Merz was far and away the most popular. Polling in September had him at 63% support among CDU-CSU voters, well ahead of the other two candidates. At the time, he also had 37% support among the wider electorate, the most of any candidate. However, things went downhill from there. Polling in Der Spiegel in November had him at only 33% support among CDU-CSU voters and 26% among the wider electorate. That's not to say the other candidates were doing brilliantly either. As you can probably see, Röttgen was at 11% and Laschet at 8%. Another thing worth noticing is that Jens Spahn, the health minister who's backing Laschet, was also included in the polling, and he did pretty well, despite the fact he's not even in the race, coming in second after Merz among the wider electorate. So on Saturday, with the process over, the results were announced. In the first round of voting, Merz got 385 votes, Laschet 380, and Röttgen 224. As a result, Röttgen dropped out, and Laschet won the runoff, with 521 votes against Merz's 466. This is a victory for Laschet, but you might have noticed those numbers look pretty bleak for his party. None of the candidates were particularly popular with the wider electorate, especially when compared to Merkel, and Laschet was probably the least popular. However, that doesn't mean that it's all over for their electoral prospects in the election later this year. That's because it's important to note that the CDU's leader isn't necessarily the CDU-CSU Chancellor candidate, although historically it has been the case. Merkel, for example, was both the CDU's leader and the CDU-CSU candidate. But with Laschet polling so badly, now might be a time for things to change, and there are two other possible candidates they could pick. First is Jens Spahn, the health minister we mentioned earlier. He's had a pretty good pandemic. He backed the right horse by picking Laschet, and he polls pretty well. However, he's currently having a bit of a tough time because Germany's vaccine rollout is going slower than some might like. He's also pretty young at just 40 years old, so a relatively new face in German politics. The other option is the leader of the CSU in Bavaria, Markus Söder. Now, Söder has said that he doesn't want to be Chancellor and would prefer to stay in Bavaria, but at least according to the polling, he's by far and away the most popular. History says that CSU Chancellor candidates generally don't do that well. The last one, for example, Edmund Stoiber, lost the 2002 federal election to the SDP, but Söder does look better than the other candidates this time round. Politically, he's a charismatic, flexible politician, and he's had a good pandemic. Even though the case rates aren't that much better in Bavaria than other German states, he's looked strong and decisive. And the same polling from November puts him well ahead of everyone else. The most recent polling we could find from January has him well ahead, and notably, Laschet is doing pretty badly. It's also worth noting that he's ahead of Olaf Scholz, the SDP candidate for Chancellor, who would likely be the CDU-CSU's main opposition. Interestingly, Spahn comes in second for CDU-CSU voters in this polling, and when CDU-CSU voters are asked to rank candidates from -5 to +5, only Söder comes anywhere close to Merkel. The last thing worth saying about polling is that when voters are asked whether the CDU should move in a more conservative direction, voters overwhelmingly thought no. And this is probably why Merz lost. Voters didn't want the CDU to tack to the right. So the point is that Laschet isn't electoral gold. So it's very possible that despite winning this election, he doesn't end up as the CDU-CSU's Chancellor candidate. As a final note, it's worth saying that none of them will be able to do what Merkel's done. Merkel's been the leader of the CDU since 2002 and Chancellor since 2005, and her approval ratings are still phenomenal. After a good pandemic, they currently sit at 84%, with the CDU-CSU well ahead of any other parties. Those are approval ratings that other politicians would die for. To put this into context, Johnson currently sits at 37%, Macron at 31%, and Trump at 39%. And despite the rise of the AfD, which has taken some of the more conservative voters from the CDU, Merkel has always been able to constantly find electoral replacements, whether by swinging female voters or migrant voters. Anyway, the point is that Merkel is a tough act to follow. She's been Chancellor for 15 years, with phenomenal approval ratings, and could apparently win another term if she felt like it. And therefore none of the CDU's leadership candidates come even close to her electorally. What comes next, though, will be important not just for Germany, but the entirety of Europe and the world, with Germany's leader always a major power on the international stage. Whether the CDU-CSU pick Laschet or someone else, the upcoming German election is one to watch. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more updates as this situation plays out, and hit the bell to be notified whenever we post new videos. Also, if you're interested in the global side of things, then be sure to subscribe to our new channel, TLDR Global. There's a link to that in the description. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible, and if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.